Have you ever noticed that peculiar correlation? When disaster strikes, when chaos erupts, when uncertainty reaches its peak, that's precisely when humans turn most desperately toward God. It's one of those patterns that hides in plain sight, so common we rarely stop to question it. Think of how prayer intensifies during pandemics, how churches fill after tragedies, how there are no atheists in foxholes. This strange relationship between terror and faith spans across cultures, across history, across theological systems. There's something almost suspicious about this correlation, a pattern so consistent it demands deeper investigation. What if this relationship isn't coincidental but causal? What if fear isn't merely one reason humans believe in God, but the primary psychological origin of the divine concept itself? This unsettling possibility opens a door to one of philosophy's most disturbing questions. Was God discovered through revelation and reason, or was God invented as a psychological response to humanity's deepest terror? The terror of living in an indifferent, chaotic universe with no inherent meaning, no cosmic justice, and no guarantee of safety. The conventional narrative tells us that humans discovered God through some combination of revelation, reason, and spiritual experience. But what if we've been reading the evidence backwards? What if the actual sequence runs in the opposite direction? Not that God created humans, but that humans created God as the ultimate psychological shield against existential dread. What if divine beings weren't discovered, but invented as sophisticated psychological mechanisms for managing our most profound fears? This uncomfortable question lurking beneath religious history is deeply disturbing. Have we been projecting our terror of chaos onto the cosmos and calling the resulting image God? What if our deities, with their promises of cosmic order, ultimate justice, and final meaning, are actually elaborate psychological constructions, not windows into cosmic truth, but mirrors reflecting our deepest existential anxieties? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of how we understand religion, spirituality, and the human condition itself. If our conceptions of God emerged primarily from fear rather than love or revelation, how might this change our understanding of religious experience? If divine beings were created as psychological shields against terror, what happens when we no longer need those shields? What remains of spirituality when fear no longer drives our cosmic narratives? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of religious belief? A philosopher who dared to ask whether our most sacred concepts might actually be serving very human, all too human purposes. A thinker whose analysis of religion focused not on theological arguments, but on the psychological needs that religious concepts fulfill. Why do we find this possibility so disturbing? Could it be that what terrifies us isn't the non-existence of God, but the recognition of our role in creating the divine? What if the ultimate blasphemy isn't denying God's existence, but understanding God's psychological origin in human fear? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about faith, meaning, and the human condition. They offer a perspective on religion not as cosmic truth, but as sophisticated psychological response to existential terror. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in religious history that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent across cultures and throughout time that it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar correlation between human fear and divine conception. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly during humanity's moments of greatest vulnerability and terror. Consider how gods emerge in human history. The earliest divine figures weren't benevolent creators, but personifications of nature's most terrifying aspects. Storm gods hurling lightning, sea gods commanding devastating floods, underworld deities governing the terrifying unknown of death. From Mesopotamian Humbaba, who guarded the dark forest, to Norse Thor, who controlled devastating thunderstorms. From Aztec Tlaloc, who determined drought or rain, to Greek Poseidon, who could sink ships at will. Early gods personified precisely those natural forces humans most feared and couldn't control. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse cultures. The specific theological details change, the cultural contexts shift, but the psychological function remains strikingly consistent. Divine beings emerge as personifications of the terrifying unknown, giving a face to faceless forces, making the uncontrollable seem potentially controllable through ritual, sacrifice, and prayer. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how religious intensity correlates with human vulnerability. Religious devotion intensifies precisely during times of greatest uncertainty and danger, during plagues, wars, natural disasters, and social upheaval. The more chaotic and threatening the world appears, the more humans cling to divine order and protection. This correlation isn't occasional but systematic, appearing across cultures and throughout history with remarkable consistency. The anomaly extends beyond historical development into the very structure of religious concepts. The divine attributes that appear most consistently across traditions, omniscience, omnipotence, cosmic justice, directly address humanity's most fundamental fears. The fear of being unseen and forgotten, the fear of powerlessness, the fear that suffering has no meaning or purpose. Divine concepts don't appear randomly, but systematically address specific existential anxieties with remarkable precision. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss theology, ritual, doctrine, and belief at length, but we seldom examine this specific psychological correlation, how divine concepts systematically emerge from and address human fear. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how consistently religious intensity correlates with existential terror. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that religion's most powerful function might not be revealing cosmic truth, but rather providing psychological mechanisms for managing humanity's deepest fears. What if religious concepts emerged not primarily from revelation or reason, but from the basic human need to transform the terrifying unknown into the potentially controllable known? This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into human psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether our most sacred concepts might actually be serving very human, all too human purposes. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between human fear and divine conception? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? In the autumn of 1879, Friedrich Nietzsche found himself alone in a small rented room in the Swiss mountain village of St. Moritz. At 35, his health was deteriorating. Debilitating migraines, stomach ailments, and failing eyesight had forced him to resign his professorship at the University of Basel. His books were largely ignored by the intellectual establishment, sometimes selling fewer than 100 copies. He lived in near poverty, moving between cheap lodgings as his meager pension allowed. By conventional standards, Nietzsche's life appeared to be defined by failure and suffering. It was within this context of physical pain, professional rejection, and social isolation that Nietzsche began to formulate his most penetrating insights about the psychological origins of religious belief. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point from which to examine the relationship between suffering and faith. Having grown up as the son of a Lutheran pastor who had died when Friedrich was only 4, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of religious comfort from the inside. Yet his own experience of relentless suffering without apparent meaning or purpose had led him to question the psychological foundations of religious belief. What made Nietzsche's perspective on religion especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Here was a man intimately familiar with existential terror, with physical suffering that had no apparent purpose, with social rejection that offered no redemptive narrative, with the daily confrontation with meaninglessness and cosmic indifference. Each day, as physical pain racked his body and social isolation engulfed his spirit, Nietzsche lived the very question at the heart of his philosophy. How does the human mind respond to unbearable suffering in an indifferent universe? During his solitary walks through the alpine landscape, taken during brief respites from his physical ailments, Nietzsche contemplated the psychological function of religious concepts. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how consistently religious intensity correlated with human vulnerability and fear. Rather than seeing this as evidence for religion's truth, he recognized it as revealing something profound about religion's psychological origin, not in revelation or reason, but in the human need to transform terrifying chaos into potentially controllable order. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to develop what would become one of his most disturbing insights: that religious concepts emerged primarily not from divine revelation, but from human psychology. Specifically, from the psychological need to transform the terrifying unknown into the potentially controllable known. God wasn't a cosmic truth humans discovered, but a psychological construct humans created to manage their deepest existential fears. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from abstract theorizing, but from Nietzsche's own wrestling with suffering and meaning. Each day, as he faced physical pain with no apparent purpose and social rejection with no redemptive narrative, he confronted the temptation to find comfort in religious explanations. Each day, he observed in himself the very psychological mechanism he was describing: the human tendency to seek refuge from unbearable reality in comforting metaphysical constructions. It was this personal confrontation with suffering that gave Nietzsche's philosophical insights their unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely analyzing religious concepts academically, he was uncovering their psychological function through his own lived experience. As he would later write in The Gay Science, "Only great pain is the ultimate liberator of the spirit. I doubt that such pain makes us better, but I know that it makes us more profound." This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how human fear shaped divine conception. It wasn't merely a critique of religious belief, but a profound psychological insight into how humans transform existential terror into cosmic narrative. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern, and what implications might it have for how we understand religion, spirituality, and the human condition itself? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of religious history. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how divine concepts evolved across cultures and throughout history. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice: the systematic correlation between what humans most feared and what they attributed to divine power. In Human, All Too Human, published in 1878, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. In the imagination of religious people, all good things are attributed to God as effects, and all evil things, for the purpose of exculpating him, are attributed to someone else. This observation reveals Nietzsche's recognition that divine concepts aren't arbitrary, but structured specifically to address human fears, transforming the terrifying randomness of misfortune into a potentially meaningful and controllable narrative. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying the comfort that religious belief provides, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its specific psychological origin: how divine concepts emerge primarily from fear, rather than love, wonder, or reason. The attributes we assign to gods aren't random, but precisely calibrated to address our deepest existential anxieties with remarkable precision. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in the historical development of religious concepts. He noted how early gods were primarily fearsome entities who personified nature's most terrifying aspects: storm gods, underworld deities, war gods, while later religious development increasingly emphasized divine benevolence, protection, and cosmic justice. Rather than seeing this as progressive revelation, he recognized it as revealing the psychological function of divine concepts, transforming the terrifying unknown into the potentially controllable known. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's comparative analysis of religious intensification during periods of social crisis. Looking at historical periods of plague, war, natural disaster, and social upheaval, he noticed how religious devotion consistently intensified precisely when human vulnerability and fear reached their peak. The pattern was remarkably consistent. The more chaotic and threatening the world appeared, the more humans clung to divine order and protection. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how divine attributes systematically address specific human fears with remarkable precision. The concept of divine omniscience addresses the fear of being unseen and forgotten. Divine omnipotence addresses the fear of powerlessness in a threatening world. Divine justice addresses the fear that suffering has no meaning or purpose. Divine eternity addresses the fear of mortality and impermanence. Each divine attribute functions as a precise psychological antidote to a specific existential anxiety. This systematic correlation between human fears and divine attributes revealed something profound about how religious concepts function psychologically. They aren't arbitrary cultural constructions, but sophisticated psychological mechanisms for transforming the terrifying unknown into the potentially meaningful and controllable known. As Nietzsche would later write in The Gay Science, God is a thought that makes crooked all that is straight and makes stand still all that is moving. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across religious history. From primitive animism to sophisticated monotheism, divine concepts consistently emerge as psychological responses to human fear, transforming the terrifying chaos of existence into potentially meaningful cosmic narratives. But if Nietzsche's initial observations revealed this pattern, his deeper investigation would uncover something even more profound: how the concept of God evolved specifically as the ultimate psychological response to existential terror. Not just fear of specific dangers, but the more fundamental fear of living in a universe with no inherent meaning, no cosmic justice, and no guarantee of safety. What deeper patterns did Nietzsche discover as he continued his investigation? And what implications might these patterns have for how we understand religion, spirituality, and the human condition itself? As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the relationship between fear and divine conception extended far beyond specific dangers into the realm of existential anxiety, the terror not just of particular threats, but of existence itself in a seemingly indifferent universe. This recognition led him to one of his most penetrating insights: that the concept of God evolved as the ultimate psychological response to what he called the terror of existence. The fundamental human anxiety of living in a world without inherent meaning, cosmic justice, or guaranteed safety. In The Gay Science, published in 1882, Nietzsche expanded this analysis. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? This famous passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that divine concepts don't merely address specific fears, but provide comprehensive psychological frameworks for managing the fundamental terror of existing in a seemingly meaningless universe. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this existential anxiety isn't merely philosophical but visceral, a profound psychological vertigo that emerges when humans confront the possibility that the universe contains no inherent meaning, purpose, or moral order. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, he who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. This isn't merely poetic language, but psychological observation about the terrifying effect of confronting existential meaninglessness. Nietzsche began to see that religious concepts evolved not just to explain natural phenomena or justify social arrangements, but to address this more fundamental existential anxiety. The concept of divine purpose addresses the fear that existence might be fundamentally purposeless. The concept of divine justice addresses the fear that suffering might be fundamentally meaningless. The concept of divine presence addresses the fear that we might be fundamentally alone in an indifferent cosmos. Each aspect of divine conception functions as a precise psychological antidote to a specific dimension of existential terror. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights: that the concept of God serves as the ultimate psychological shield against the terror of existence itself. As he writes in The Antichrist, what is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that a resistance is overcome. This isn't merely a critique of morality, but a recognition that religious concepts function psychologically to transform the terrifying experience of powerlessness in an indifferent universe into the comforting sense of cosmic significance and divine protection. The pattern became increasingly clear. What we call God emerged not primarily from revelation or reason, but from the psychological need to transform the terrifying chaos of existence into meaningful cosmic order. Divine concepts don't just explain the world, they make it psychologically habitable by providing comprehensive frameworks that address our deepest existential anxieties with remarkable precision. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the psychological power of religious belief might lie not in its metaphysical truth, but in its psychological function, providing the ultimate shield against the terror of existence itself. God had become, for many, primarily a psychological construct that transforms the terrifying experience of cosmic insignificance into the comforting sense of cosmic significance. As Nietzsche continued his investigation, he found evidence for this pattern in countless domains of religious experience. In prayer, where the terrifying experience of cosmic solitude is transformed into the comforting sense of divine presence. In theological doctrines, where the terrifying possibility of cosmic meaninglessness is transformed into the comforting certainty of divine purpose. In moral frameworks, where the terrifying absence of cosmic justice is transformed into the comforting promise of ultimate accountability. What implications might this understanding have for how we approach religion, spirituality, and the human condition itself? And what might it reveal about the possibility of meaning and value in a world where we can no longer rely on divine guarantees? As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse religious traditions. The psychological function of divine conception wasn't isolated to particular cultures or historical periods, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout human history. The pattern was clear. Wherever humans confronted the terror of existence, the anxiety of living in a seemingly indifferent universe, they developed increasingly sophisticated divine concepts that transformed that terror into manageable meaning. In the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. Man, the bravest animal and most prone to suffer, does not deny suffering as such. He wills it. He even seeks it out, provided he is shown a meaning for it, a purpose of suffering. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that the primary psychological function of divine concepts isn't to eliminate suffering, but to make it meaningful, to transform the terrifying randomness of misfortune into purposeful narrative within a cosmic framework. The pattern revealed itself in religious responses to natural disasters, where the terrifying randomness of earthquake or flood was transformed into meaningful divine punishment or test. It appeared in theological responses to innocent suffering, where the disturbing injustice of children's pain was transformed into mysterious divine purpose beyond human understanding. It emerged in eschatological visions of ultimate justice, where the disturbing absence of cosmic accountability was transformed into the certainty of final judgment. In each case, the same psychological mechanism operated, transforming the terrifying chaos of existence into meaningful cosmic order. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in the historical development of divine attributes. As human understanding of the natural world expanded through science, divine concepts didn't disappear, but rather evolved to address the remaining zones of existential anxiety. Gods retreated from explaining physical phenomena, thunder, disease, harvest, to addressing psychological phenomena, meaning, purpose, value, precisely those domains where scientific explanation couldn't alleviate existential terror. The pattern persisted. Divine concepts continued to function as psychological shields against the remaining territories of existential anxiety. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across contexts. Whether in primitive animism or sophisticated monotheism, whether in ancient myths or modern theology, the same psychological mechanism operated. Divine concepts transformed the terrifying chaos of existence into meaningful cosmic order. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, the irrationality of a thing is no argument against its existence, rather a condition of it. This insight reveals his recognition that religious concepts persist not because of their logical coherence, but because of their psychological utility in managing existential anxiety. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that behind many of our most sacred concepts often lurks something much more primal, the simple human terror of existing in a universe that offers no inherent meaning, no cosmic justice, and no guarantee of safety. God had become, for many, primarily a psychological shield against the fundamental anxiety of human existence, the terror of cosmic insignificance and moral solitude. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if many of our religious frameworks, moral systems, and metaphysical doctrines had evolved primarily to shield us from the terror of existence? What if the concept of God served not primarily as cosmic truth, but as the ultimate psychological response to existential anxiety? This recognition wasn't merely an academic observation, but a profound challenge to how we understand religion, spirituality, and the human condition itself. If we've been using God primarily as a psychological shield against existential terror, what might become possible if we faced that terror directly? What version of spirituality might emerge if we stopped using divine concepts to avoid existential anxiety and instead embraced the creative possibilities that emerge from confronting it? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore the deeper implications of Nietzsche's discovery. What does it mean for how we understand religion, spirituality, and the possibility of meaning and value in a world where we can no longer rely on divine guarantees? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond religious criticism into the very heart of how we understand human psychology, spirituality, and the possibility of meaning and value in a world without divine guarantees. If the concept of God evolved primarily as a psychological response to existential terror, then addressing this insight requires more than merely questioning religious belief. It demands a fundamental reconsideration of how we approach the terror of existence itself. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel represents the spirit that bears the weight of traditional values and predetermined meaning. The lion represents the courage to say no to these inherited frameworks and create space for something new. The child represents the capacity for genuine creation, for saying yes to life and creating new values beyond the shadow of divine guarantees. This framework reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Moving beyond God as psychological shield requires more than intellectual rejection of religious concepts. It demands the courage to face existential terror directly and the creative capacity to generate meaning without the comfort of cosmic guarantees. The first profound implication is psychological. If we've been using God as a shield against existential terror, then authentic spiritual development requires facing that terror directly, rather than seeking refuge in comforting metaphysical constructions. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, the certain prospect of death could infuse our lives with a precious, fragrant drop of levity, and now you strange apothecary souls have made of it a drop of poison that makes the whole of life repulsive. This passage reveals his recognition that confronting mortality directly, rather than seeking refuge in promises of eternal life, might actually intensify rather than diminish our appreciation of existence. The second implication is existential. If divine concepts have functioned primarily to shield us from the terror of cosmic insignificance, then authentic living requires embracing rather than avoiding that terror. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, what if some day or night a demon were to steal into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, the eternal hourglass of existence is turned over again and again, and you with it, a dust grain of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? This famous passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that confronting cosmic insignificance directly, rather than seeking refuge in promises of cosmic significance, might open the possibility for a more authentic affirmation of life. The third implication is spiritual. If God emerged primarily from fear rather than love, then authentic spirituality might involve not finding divine purpose but creating purpose in a world without cosmic guarantees. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are." This isn't about becoming whatever you want, but rather discovering and expressing the creative potential that defines authentic human existence, not as fulfillment of divine plan, but as genuine self-creation in a world without predetermined meaning. Perhaps the most profound implication is transformative. If divine concepts have functioned primarily as psychological shields against existential terror, then genuine spiritual transformation might involve not reinforcing these shields, but gradually dismantling them, learning to face the terror of existence directly, and discovering the creative possibilities that emerge when we no longer need metaphysical comfort. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, after Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too. This recognition poses a profound challenge. What might become possible if we stopped using God as psychological shield and instead faced existential terror directly? What creative possibilities might emerge when we no longer need divine guarantees to make life meaningful? The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond individual psychology into what might be called a conspiracy of comfort, a collective agreement to avoid existential terror through increasingly sophisticated systems of metaphysical consolation. This isn't a conscious conspiracy, but rather a cultural evolution driven by the human desire to avoid the fundamental anxiety of existence. The terror of living in a universe that offers no inherent meaning, no cosmic justice, and no guarantee of safety. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the development of religious and philosophical systems that shielded humans from existential terror. What began as simple animistic attempts to control frightening natural forces evolved into increasingly sophisticated theological frameworks that provided comprehensive explanations for suffering, purpose, and meaning. Explanations that conveniently removed the terror of cosmic insignificance from human shoulders. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the basic human desire for psychological comfort. As Nietzsche writes in Human, All Too Human, metaphysical explanations comfort humans where they and scientific investigation have not yet been able to light the way. The desire for comfort isn't inherently problematic. The issue arises when comfort comes at the cost of authenticity, growth, and the possibility of creating genuine meaning in a world without cosmic guarantees. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it persists even as traditional religious belief declines. Nietzsche observed how the same psychological mechanism, seeking refuge from existential terror, continued through secular frameworks like deterministic science, historical inevitability, or political utopianism. Different language, same psychological function. Avoiding the anxiety of existence through systems that provide predetermined meaning and purpose. As he writes in Twilight of the Idols, they all want to get to the throne. That is their madness, as if happiness sat on the throne. Often mud sits on the throne, and often also the throne on mud. This insight reveals Nietzsche's recognition that secular systems often continue the same psychological function as religious ones, providing illusory certainty in a fundamentally uncertain existence. The conspiracy extends into educational systems that often prioritize predetermined meaning over creative capacity, political frameworks that displace existential anxiety onto external enemies or utopian futures, and therapeutic approaches that sometimes medicate existential anxiety rather than engaging it as potentially transformative. Each domain develops its own language, but the psychological function remains consistent, avoiding the fundamental terror of existing without cosmic guarantees. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability. As traditional religious frameworks lose cultural authority, the same psychological function continues through other channels: scientific determinism, technological utopianism, political ideology, or materialistic consumption. Different language, same psychological comfort, the relief from confronting existence without predetermined meaning or purpose. This recognition reveals something unsettling about modern secularism, that it often continues the same psychological pattern while changing only the language. The person who seeks absolute certainty in scientific materialism, who places unbounded faith in technological progress, or who finds salvation in political ideology, is engaging in essentially the same psychological mechanism as the religious believer, seeking refuge from the terror of existence in systems that promise certainty and purpose. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that religious belief might be psychologically motivated, but that it serves a function that continues even as the specific concepts change. The real conspiracy isn't religious doctrine, but the deeper human tendency to avoid the fundamental challenge of existence, creating meaning and value in a world without cosmic guarantees. This pattern raises profound questions about human psychology, spiritual development, and the possibility of authentic living. If we've been collectively engaged in avoiding existential terror through increasingly sophisticated systems of metaphysical consolation, what might become possible if we consciously confronted this tendency? What version of humanity might emerge if we stepped out from behind these psychological shields and embraced the creative possibilities that emerge from facing existence directly? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged and what it might mean for the possibility of genuine transformation, both individual and collective. Why has the psychological origin of divine concepts remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound influence on human history? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective avoidance driven by the basic human relationship to existential terror. Confronting this pattern would mean facing the anxiety of existence without metaphysical comfort, precisely what the pattern evolved to help us avoid. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that beliefs persist not primarily because of their truth value, but because of their psychological utility. And few things are more psychologically useful than relief from the terror of cosmic insignificance and moral solitude. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining the idea that divine concepts emerged from revelation rather than psychological need. Acknowledging the fear-based origin of divine conception would undermine the authority of religious frameworks and the comfort they provide. It's not that religious leaders consciously suppress this insight, but rather that their entire framework depends on maintaining the primacy of divine revelation over human psychological construction. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, in Christianity, neither morality nor religion come into contact with reality at any point. This isn't merely criticism, but recognition of how religious frameworks often function by creating psychological distance from existential terror, rather than tools for engaging it directly. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by celebrating certainty over the creative potential of uncertainty. From religious fundamentalism to scientific materialism, from political dogmatism to consumerist distraction, dominant cultural frameworks often promise answers precisely where the absence of answers might be most productively engaging. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of systems that address the basic human ambivalence toward existential freedom and responsibility. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by prioritizing received knowledge over creative engagement with uncertainty. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one repays a teacher badly if one remains only a pupil. This insight reveals how education might serve not just to transmit existing frameworks, but to develop the capacity for creating meaning in a world without predetermined answers. Yet this more challenging function is frequently subordinated to the comfort of certainty. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because confronting it would mean facing what Nietzsche called the greatest weight, the recognition that there may be no predetermined meaning guiding our lives, just the meaning we ourselves create. This prospect is so psychologically challenging that most prefer the comfort of metaphysical frameworks, even if they come at the cost of authentic engagement with existence. The pattern persists not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for comfort over growth, certainty over ambiguity, and predetermined meaning over the terrifying freedom of conscious creation. As Nietzsche writes in The Will to Power, what does nihilism mean? That the highest values devaluate themselves. The aim is lacking. Why? Finds no answer. This passage reveals his recognition that the collapse of metaphysical comfort creates a psychological crisis precisely because we've relied on these frameworks to shield us from existential terror. Yet this crisis might also be the precondition for a more authentic relationship to existence. What does this mean for the possibility of genuine spiritual development and authentic engagement with existence? If we've been collectively engaged in avoiding existential terror through divine concepts, what might become possible if we consciously confronted this tendency? What version of spirituality might emerge if we stopped using God as psychological shield and instead faced the terror of existence directly? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of meaning and value beyond the shadow of divine guarantees, not through finding cosmic purpose, but through embracing what he called amor fati, love of fate, and the creative possibilities that emerge when we no longer need metaphysical comfort to make life meaningful. The final question isn't whether God exists, but whether divine concepts emerged primarily from human fear rather than divine revelation. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about human psychology, our tendency to transform existential terror into cosmic narrative. But it also reveals something even more significant: the possibility of meaning and value that emerges when we step out from behind these psychological shields and face existence directly. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the Übermensch, not a superior being in the crude biological sense, but rather a way of living that embraces existence without metaphysical comfort. I teach you the overman, Zarathustra says. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? This question points to Nietzsche's recognition that authentic living requires overcoming our tendency to seek refuge from existential terror and instead embracing the creative responsibility that defines human existence. This isn't about rejecting spirituality, but transforming it, moving from a spirituality based on fear to one based on creative affirmation. Perhaps the most authentic spiritual moments aren't when we find metaphysical comfort, but when we embrace existence in all its terror and beauty without needing cosmic guarantees. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati, let that be my love henceforth. This concept of amor fati, the love of fate, represents Nietzsche's vision of spiritual transformation beyond metaphysical comfort. It means embracing existence not because it fulfills divine purpose, but because it's the only existence we have, with all its suffering, uncertainty, and beauty. This isn't passive acceptance, but active embrace, taking responsibility not just for finding meaning, but for creating it in a world without cosmic guarantees. What might this look like in practice? It means examining our relationship to fear, noticing when we seek metaphysical comfort precisely when facing life's most difficult realities. It means asking whether our spiritual frameworks serve primarily as shields against existential terror, or as tools for engaging that terror directly and creatively. It means recognizing when we use concepts like divine purpose or cosmic justice, primarily to avoid the anxiety of living in a universe that may offer no predetermined meaning or guaranteed moral order. It means developing practices that don't just alleviate existential anxiety, but transform it into creative capacity. Meditation, not as technique for transcending reality, but as practice in facing it directly. Prayer not just as petition for divine intervention, but as exercise in articulating our deepest values without cosmic guarantees. Community not just as validation of shared beliefs, but as collaborative creation of meaning in a world where meaning isn't predetermined. Most importantly, it means recognizing that the voice that emerges when we stop seeking divine guarantees isn't just nihilistic despair, but creative affirmation. What Nietzsche called the will to power in its authentic sense, not as domination, but as creative expression of life's fundamental nature. This isn't arbitrary self-invention, but discovery and expression of the creative potential that defines authentic human existence. The path forward isn't about rejecting religion, but transforming it, moving from a spirituality based on fear to one based on creative affirmation. Whether within religious frameworks or beyond them, authentic spirituality requires embracing the fundamental challenge of human existence, creating meaning and value in a world without cosmic guarantees. What might become possible if you stopped using God as psychological shield against existential terror, and instead embraced that terror as the precondition for authentic living? What might emerge if you approached spirituality not as escape from existence, but as full engagement with it, without metaphysical comfort, but with creative responsibility? What voice might you discover if you stopped seeking cosmic guarantees and instead embraced the creative possibilities that emerge from their absence? The answer to these questions won't come from external revelation, but from your own courageous confrontation with existence and its creative possibilities. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are." This isn't about becoming whatever you want, but rather discovering and expressing the creative potential that defines authentic human existence, not as fulfillment of divine plan, but as genuine self-creation in a world without predetermined meaning. The real spiritual journey isn't finding God, but facing the possibility that divine concepts emerged primarily from human fear, and discovering what remains of spirituality when we no longer need metaphysical comfort to make life meaningful. Perhaps what remains isn't nihilism or despair, but the possibility of a more authentic affirmation, loving existence, not because it fulfills cosmic purpose, but because it's the only existence we have, with all its terror, uncertainty, and beauty.